Callie Rivera had always found peace in the sound of waves. After 22 years in the Navy, she returned not to medals or parades, but to the one place that had always been home. A weathered beach house nestled on the edge of Seabreeze Point, its cedar shingles faded from decades of salt and sun. It had been in her family since 1967, a small inheritance from her father, a fisherman who'd bought the land before the coast turned fashionable, before the beach became a battlefront. Callie wasn't interested in beach clubs, community barbecues, or social committees. She preferred the creak of her porch swing, the scratch of graphite against her sketchbook, and the hush of morning tides. The town knew her as the veteran down by the rocks, quiet, polite, but firm. She kept to herself and asked for nothing. And for a while, that was enough. Until the HOA came knocking. Seabreeze Point had changed in the years Callie was away. What had once been a sleepy coastal nook was now a curated oceanfront experience, complete with champagne-colored sidewalks and HOA-mandated palm trees. The homes had gone from wood-framed cottages to pastel mansions, and with them came a new type of neighbor, one who measured value not in salt and soul, but in curb appeal. The center of it all stood Karen Elizabeth Duvall, the HOA president and self-proclaimed protector of coastal harmony. Tall, impeccably styled, and always 3 steps ahead of a regulation, Karen was the type who smiled through her threats and signed fines with a fountain pen. She'd only been in Seabreeze Point for 5 years, but her influence spread like mildew in humid air, and to Karen, Callie's property was a problem. It didn't fit. The fence wasn't whitewashed. The porch didn't sparkle. A faded American flag flew from the deck, and a weathered fishing boat sat proudly just beyond the dunes. A vessel her father had once taken to sea and she now used for quiet paddles beyond the rocks. Karen called it visual clutter. The first letter came on monogrammed stationery. Dear Ms. Rivera, as part of Seabreeze Point's commitment to maintaining scenic integrity, we respectfully request that all residents conform to neighborhood aesthetic standards, including the removal of unsightly watercraft, non-regulation fencing, and unapproved porch decor. Callie read it once, then fed it to her fireplace. But they didn't stop. A week later, a friendly notice was pinned to her door, citing concerns about her flag fading outside of federal display guidelines. The following week, she received a letter suggesting she repaint her home to better align with the coastal palette, complete with pastel color swatches attached. Then came the clipboard inspections. Karen's volunteers strolling past with phones out, whispering and pointing. But what made it all absurd was this. Callie's home wasn't part of the HOA. Her father had purchased the land before the HOA was ever formed. The property line sat just outside its legal reach, close enough to be seen but not owned. She had no obligation to follow their rules, and Karen hated that. One afternoon, Callie found Karen herself standing at the edge of her driveway, arms crossed, sunglasses perched atop her head like a crown. Ms. Rivera, she began sweetly, I thought we might chat neighbor to neighbor. Callie stepped onto her porch, wiping salt off her hands with a rag. You mean HOA to civilian? Karen's smile thinned. Well, we do share a community, even if your home falls just outside the official map. We all have a responsibility to keep Seabreeze beautiful. I keep it clean, I keep it mine, that's enough. Karen glanced past her, eyes landing on the boat. That vessel is parked awfully close to the shared beach access. There's no access. That's my land. Well, some of our recent community maps suggest otherwise. Boundaries shift with time, you know. Erosion. Tides. Callie raised an eyebrow. The law doesn't shift with your HOA newsletter. Karen's smile returned, tight, calculated. Of course, we'll be in touch. That night, Callie walked the shoreline by lantern light, her bare feet pressing into sand her father had once called sacred. She looked back at her house, small, stubborn, unpolished, just like her. The wind carried a new scent, not salt, but trouble. And Callie knew one thing for sure. Karen had drawn her first line in the sand, but Callie wasn't going anywhere. 3 days after Karen's not-so-friendly visit, Callie woke up to the sound of metal scraping sand. She stepped out barefoot onto her porch just in time to see 2 HOA contractors, dressed in bright polo shirts and reflective vests, dragging her father's boat across the beach. "Hey!" she called out, storming down the steps. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" One of them turned, clipboard in hand. "Just clearing unapproved equipment from community access zones," Callie planted her feet in the sand. "That's my property." The man shrugged. "HOA directive. We're just following orders." "Then you're following the wrong ones." Before she could say more, Karen appeared from the dune path, heels sinking into the sand but posture unwavering. "Callie," she said with her signature fake warmth. "This really could have been avoided if you just responded to our compliance letters." Callie walked past the contractor and stood between her boat and Karen. "You crossed onto my land. You moved my property. That's trespassing." Karen's tone didn't change. "We're enforcing access to the beach. The community recently passed a resolution to reclaim and preserve the shoreline as shared space. You don't get to reclaim something you never owned." Karen held out a rolled-up document like a magician revealing a trick. "This is the updated coastal zoning map, approved by the county 2 years ago. You'll see this section of the shoreline now falls under a community recreation overlay." Callie took it, eyes scanning the blurry lines, red marks, and freshly added Access Corridor D, conveniently stretching right across her backyard. She looked back at Karen. "This isn't a map. It's a fantasy." Karen's smile thinned. "You may want to consult an attorney. Non-compliance can be costly." Later that afternoon, a freshly printed HOA community zone, no private equipment beyond this point sign appeared at the edge of her dune. Below it, HOA security cameras were mounted on a solar-powered pole, facing directly at Callie's backyard. That night, a letter was hand-delivered to her door. "You are hereby notified that your vessel is in violation of HOA Recreational Use Policy 14.7. Failure to comply within 72 hours will result in fines of $500 per day." Callie didn't get angry. She got focused. The next day, she drove to the county records office, a modest brick building inland from the coast. The clerk on duty, a balding man in his 60s wearing a Vietnam vet hat, read the document Karen had given her and laughed. "This overlay was submitted by the HOA, not the county," he said. "Looks like it was reviewed but never formally approved. No stamp, no signature." Callie leaned on the counter. "So the beach behind my house, what does the original zoning say?" He pulled up the township's archive and navigated to a scan of the 1967 plat map. "Here it is," he said, tapping the screen. "You see this dark line? That's the high tide mark. Everything inland of that is considered riparian property, belonging to the adjacent landowner. In this case, you." Callie stared at the map, the familiar curves of the coastline, the scribbled initials of her father in fading ink. "So, by law, the HOA has no jurisdiction?" The clerk chuckled. "Not a damn inch." But when she returned home, the situation had escalated. Karen had posted a notice on the community board and online forum stating, "Due to recent boundary clarification, the Seabreeze Point HOA will begin coastal beautification efforts, including removal of debris, unauthorized watercraft, and hazardous structures within the recreational shoreline zone." Residents were already talking. Some were confused. Others, skeptical. A few were fully on board, convinced Karen was restoring beach pride. But most were silent, afraid to speak up. That evening, as Callie walked the shoreline, a man in his 70s waved her down. He was sunburnt, wore a straw hat, and carried a folding chair. "Name's Alan," he said. "Been here since before the HOA even formed." Callie nodded. "I remember you. You used to walk your dog near the pier." Alan sighed. "Until Karen said dogs disrupted the serenity of wavefront living. I had to sell my place when they tripled my fees." He paused. "She's trying to sell the shoreline. Rumor is she's working with a resort chain, one of those fancy eco-lodges. They want exclusive beach access, and she wants the contract." Callie felt something shift in her chest. Not fear, resolve. How long's she been planning this? Alan looked her in the eye. Long enough to bury every neighbor who stood in her way. That night, Callie sat at her father's old desk. She pulled open drawers, dusted off a file box labeled Deed and Property Rights, and began digging, and there it was, a copy of the original deed. A notarized statement from 1971 confirming private beach access extending to the mean high tide line. Photos. Letters. Newspaper clippings about her father's fight to keep the land from being annexed. Decades ago, this wasn't just her land, it was a legacy, and Karen had just declared war on the wrong woman. Callie wasn't a lawyer, but she knew how to read orders and how to prepare for war. The file she found in her father's desk was more than personal paperwork. It was a timeline of resistance, carefully documented by a man who clearly foresaw that one day someone would try to take what was his. There were old maps, faded yellow with time, showing the original property boundaries, including full riparian, rights to the beach up to the mean high tide line. There was also a letter from 1982, signed by a previous county commissioner, confirming that her father's land was not part of any coastal management overlay. He had kept everything. Newspaper clippings, letters to attorneys, even a hand-drawn sketch of the shoreline that looked eerily similar to the ones Karen now claimed were obsolete. But one item stood out most: a copy of a document dated 2005. It was supposedly an update to the land records filed by the HOA and co-signed on paper by Callie's father. The problem? He had already passed away in 2003. Callie stared at the signature. It looked like her father's, but something was off. Too smooth. Too modern. No tremor in the pen strokes like in his last few years. It was a forgery. She snapped a photo of the document and drove straight to the county land office. The same clerk from before, the Vietnam vet with the gentle sarcasm, was still on shift. He squinted at the signature and frowned. This shouldn't be here, and it definitely shouldn't be valid. "Can you verify the original copy?" Callie asked. He nodded and began pulling records from a secure cabinet. After a few minutes, he placed two documents side by side. One from 1994, signed by her father, and the suspicious 2005 revision. The differences were subtle, but to anyone who knew what to look for, they screamed fraud. "This document never passed through our approval chain," the clerk said. "It's just sitting in the supplemental files. Probably slipped in during a bulk update. Happens when HOAs push corrections en masse and no one double checks. But this was intentional." Callie clenched her jaw. "And if it was used to justify land seizures?" He raised an eyebrow. "That's criminal. And whoever filed it could be liable for land fraud, false representation, and tampering with public records." Fueled with a new sense of urgency, Callie called Veronica Hale, a lawyer she'd met years ago through a fellow Navy vet. Veronica specialized in property disputes, and more importantly, she had a reputation for taking down crooked HOAs. Within 2 days, Veronica arrived at Seabreeze Point, briefcase in hand and fire in her eyes. They sat at Callie's kitchen table, maps, deeds, and photos spread between them like battle plans. "This is solid," Veronica said. "You've got historic precedent, property rights, original zoning maps, and proof of forgery." Karen built her case on sand. Callie exhaled slowly. "So what's next?" "We gather more. She's too smart to leave this all under her name. If she's selling Shoreline access, it's through a shell company or a third-party developer. We follow the money." That night, Callie couldn't sleep. She walked the shore in silence, watching moonlight play across the tide. For years, she had seen the ocean as a friend, steady, loyal, unchanging. But now, it was a boundary line in a war she didn't ask for. She remembered something her father used to say. "Anyone can build a wall. It takes guts to hold the line." And she would. "Hold it." Veronica moved fast. Within 72 hours, she uncovered a paper trail leading from the HOA's treasurer to a newly registered LLC called Blue Sand Horizons, LLC, a company that had submitted plans to acquire beachfront property for a luxury eco-resort. The HOA wasn't just enforcing compliance. They were quietly selling off the community's soul. And Karen? She was listed as the authorized representative for Shoreline negotiations. Veronica's team also found emails, leaked anonymously by a former HOA board member, discussing strategic rezoning, quiet settlements, and even incentive offers for residents willing to sell early and leave quietly. "This is bigger than we thought," Veronica told Callie. "She's using HOA authority to execute a land-flipping scheme. And your beach is the keystone." Callie looked over the documents. She felt no fear, only clarity. This isn't about property anymore, she said. It's about truth. Let's bring it into the light. Veronica nodded. Then we go public. But not just yet. We need witnesses. Callie knew just where to look. Over the next week, she met with her neighbors, especially the quiet ones, the older ones, the ones who had been gently removed over the years. Martha on Coral Lane, who was fined into bankruptcy for repainting her porch in the wrong shade of beige. Jacob, the retired Coast Guard officer, whose kayak rack had been relocated during HOA beautification. Elise and Mark, who lost their dock access because their fence didn't meet Karen's preferred style. Each of them had stories. Each of them had papers, photos, letters, and each of them was ready to speak. Callie compiled the testimonials, photos, historic maps, and evidence of fraud into a file labeled Project High Tide, The Truth About Seabreeze. She didn't shout. She didn't march. She prepared. Because when the tide finally turned, Karen wouldn't just be losing power. She'd be drowning in the truth. It started with a knock on the door. A quiet one. Hesitant, almost apologetic. Callie opened it to find Jacob Willis, the retired Coast Guard officer from 2 streets over. He stood holding a weathered envelope and an unsure smile. "I heard what you're doing," he said. "Thought you might want to see this." Inside the envelope were photos from 2011, Jacob's original kayak rack and dock right behind his house. He'd built it himself, years before the HOA was formed. Then, in 2015, Karen ordered it removed, citing unauthorized waterfront construction. She threatened daily fines unless he complied. "I didn't fight back," he admitted. "Didn't think I could." Callie placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're not alone anymore." Word spread. Within days, Callie's kitchen table was covered in letters, fines, citations, and photos. HOA violation notices dating back a decade. Receipts for mandatory community beautification fees. Threats of legal action for non-compliant landscaping. Unauthorized solar panel installations. Even a child's sandbox declared a hazardous obstruction. Most of the stories shared the same theme: compliance through intimidation, resignation through fear. And at the center of them all, Karen, Callie, and Veronica created a timeline of abuse. 12. The first land use resolution passed quietly by a 3-2 board vote, expanding HOA control toward the beach. 2014. The first Shoreline cleanup targeted homes with waterfront access. 15-2020. A spike in HOA income from compliance fines, nearly $400,000 in miscellaneous penalties collected. 21. Creation of Blue Sand Horizons, LLC. It was a pattern, a long con disguised as community improvement. And now, Callie had the receipts. One afternoon, she met Martha Jennings, a widow in her late 70s who lived in a small seafoam green cottage. Karen had once fined her for excessively bright window curtains. After 3 citations, Martha gave up and moved her bedroom into the back of the house. She welcomed Callie in with tea and a box of old HOA newsletters. "You might find something useful," she said. Karen used to brag in those. Callie leafed through them, stopping cold at one from 2016. "We're excited to begin our journey toward a cleaner, more modern shoreline, one that will elevate Seabreeze Point to a luxury coastal standard." Karen E. Duvall, HOA president. "She was laying the foundation even back then," Callie murmured. "Conditioning people to accept the future sale." Callie wasn't the only one connecting dots. Others began to whisper. Some left anonymous, notes on her doorstep. "Check the records for Lot 12. Owner never signed the HOA addendum. Karen has a second checking account. Ask Lisa in the office. I found my violation notice template in the trash. Signed before inspection even happened." A slow rumble of unrest was building. Veronica set up a secure online form where residents could upload testimony, photos, and documents. Within 48 hours, more than 40 submissions came in. Some heartbreaking. Some infuriating. One submission included a secretly recorded HOA board meeting in which Karen said, if they can't afford the fines, they shouldn't be living this close to the ocean. Another showed a side-by-side comparison of before and after maps, highlighting how HOA redrew community boundaries without approval. absorbing homes into their control to inflate fee collections. By the end of the week, Callie and Veronica had compiled it all into a digital file called the Seabreeze Papers, but information wasn't enough. They needed to take it into the heart of the community, to the very residents Karen believed she had fully under control. So Callie did something bold. She invited everyone in the community to a neighbors' night at the local marina clubhouse, a potluck-style gathering with no politics, no pressure, just stories. Karen tried to block the event, citing unauthorized gatherings violating HOA event protocol. But the marina was owned by the town, outside HOA jurisdiction. Callie smiled when she heard. Poetic. The night of the event, over 70 residents showed up. People who hadn't spoken in years sat at picnic tables, laughing over homemade seafood stew. Photos were passed, timelines discussed, and voices once silenced now shared freely. Callie stood at the front near the boat ramp and spoke calmly, but firmly. "I didn't start this to fight a war," she said. "I started because someone tried to erase my history. Then I learned they were erasing yours too." Gasps and nods followed. Veronica stepped up and shared the core findings: forged documents, illegal land rezoning, misuse of funds, and the proposed beachfront sale. Then she projected a map on the screen, highlighting how much of the original Seabreeze Point was on the verge of being handed over to developers. Silence. Then, "No way. That's my backyard. They can't sell the beach. We need to vote her out." The community wasn't just listening, they were waking up, and Karen had no idea that her biggest threat was no longer just Callie. It was everyone she'd underestimated. The room was packed. Folding chairs filled the Seabreeze Community Hall from front to back. Latecomers stood along the walls, whispering with neighbors they hadn't spoken to in years. Everyone knew this wasn't just a regular HOA meeting. This was the showdown. At the front sat the board, polished and smiling, except for one. Karen Duvall wore her usual coastal chic blazer, lips painted coral, but her eyes scanned the room with a twitch of unease. She knew something had changed. The crowd felt less submissive. She tapped the microphone. "Good evening. Let's begin with the budget update." A voice cut her off. "Before we start," Veronica Hale stood from the third row, dressed in a sharp navy suit. "I request that we allow time for a public presentation from a resident regarding community land concerns." Karen's smile didn't budge. All presentations must be submitted at least 2 weeks in advance. A chorus of voices rose up. "Let her speak. We want to hear it." "You've spoken enough, Karen." The board hesitated. The vote was taken. Unanimous. "Let her speak." Callie stood and walked slowly to the front, her boots clicking softly against the tile. She placed a folder on the table, then turned to face the crowd. "My name is Callie Rivera. Many of you know me as the veteran down by the rocks. Some of you know my father. He built our house in 1967. He also gave me something else. A responsibility to protect what's ours." She paused. "Not just for me, for all of us." She turned to the projector and clicked the remote. On the screen appeared 2 maps, one from 1967, the other from 2005. "This is the original zoning of Seabreeze Point," she said, pointing. "And this is the version submitted by the HOA in 2005, illegally, with a forged signature from my father, 2 years after he passed away." Gasps rippled across the room. Veronica stepped forward, holding up notarized documents. "We have verified the forgery with handwriting experts and official county records. This document is invalid and was used to falsely claim ownership over private beachfront properties." Karen's face stiffened. "This is a ridiculous accusation." Callie cut in. "We're not done." Next slide. A screenshot of a bank transfer. "This is a $25,000 payment from Blue Sand Horizons, LLC, to an account controlled by the HOA treasurer, just weeks before the proposed beachfront rezoning project." Another slide, a quote from Karen's 2016 HOA newsletter. "A luxury beachfront experience begins with strong leadership willing to take bold steps." Then, the recording. Karen's voice filled the room. "If they can't afford the fines, they shouldn't be living this close to the ocean." The silence was deafening. A man in the back shouted, "That's how you treated my mom!" A woman stood. "You told me I had no right to complain if I couldn't pay your beautification." "Fees!" More voices rose. "She tried to take my dock. She made me repaint my home 3 times in 1 year. She fined me for planting the wrong flowers." Karen stood, visibly shaking. "You're all being manipulated. These are lies spread by someone who's always resisted structure." Veronica stepped forward. "I have signed affidavits from 22 residents, photographs, financial records, and verified testimony from a former board member who resigned after learning of these violations." She dropped a thick file on the table with a satisfying thud. The truth isn't up for debate anymore. A hand went up from the crowd. Jacob Willis. "I move for a vote of no confidence against Karen Duvall as HOA president." Seconded, thirded, fourth. It passed, unanimously. Karen's jaw tightened, but she said nothing as her nameplate was quietly removed from the table. She walked out of the room, head high, but shoulders hunched ever so slightly. No one followed. With Karen gone, the room shifted from anger to unity. A motion was made to suspend all current fines, review all HOA spending, and form a resident-led review committee to audit the HOA's recent actions. The board, now leaderless, agreed. Then someone asked, "Callie, will you be our new president?" Callie smiled gently. "No, I didn't fight to lead. I fought to protect." She turned to leave, but then paused. One more thing. She flipped to the final slide. A photo of her father, standing barefoot on the beach, holding baby Callie, in one arm and a fishing pole in the other. This shoreline doesn't need to be sold. It needs to be remembered. And with that, she walked off stage. To applause. In the days that followed the storm, the waves felt different. Not louder, not softer, just freer. Without Karen's grip on Seabreeze Point, the community began to breathe again. Residents spoke openly in the streets, smiling without suspicion, waving without fear. The HOA board, now under interim leadership, initiated a full audit and opened public forums for the first time in years. Gone were the arbitrary citations and aesthetic violation letters. The camera pole in Callie's yard? Removed. The community access zone sign? Taken down. The $500 day fine notice? Nullified. But for Callie Rivera, the victory wasn't about paperwork. It was about the beach. She walked it every morning, just as her father once had, bare feet, pressing into the same sand that once held his footprints. On one of those mornings, she stopped and looked back. Not at her home, but at the line where HOA control had once claimed to begin. There was nothing there now. Just dune grass. Just peace. And that's when she had the idea. 2 weeks later, a new sign went up. Not in HOA colors, not in bold regulation lettering, but on driftwood, painted by hand. It read, "Welcome to Freetide Beach, respect the sea. Respect each other. No permission required." Below it, a small note. "This space is open to all. No HOA, no politics, no profit. Just ocean and community." The town loved it. Families began visiting regularly. Children brought kites. Retirees brought books. Artists brought easels. One man even proposed to his girlfriend beneath the weather-worn archway Callie had built from old fishing net and driftwood. What had once been a disputed shoreline was now a place of connection. And Callie? She stayed out of the spotlight. She was often seen walking the perimeter with her dog, sketchbook in hand, or helping an elderly neighbor push a beach wheelchair through the soft sand. She never took credit. She didn't need to. One afternoon, Callie received a visitor, a young woman, mid-30s, nervous, approached her as she watered the garden behind her home. "Are you Ms. Rivera?" Callie looked up, curious. "I am. I'm Jessica, Karen's daughter." Callie blinked. "Didn't know she had one." Jessica smiled faintly. "She doesn't talk about me. I moved out years ago, before she took over this place." There was a pause. "I saw the videos. The meeting. What you did." Jessica reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. "I found this in my mother's desk. It's different. It's not part of what she filed." You should read it. Callie took the letter. As she opened it, a folded page revealed a confession. Karen's writing, admitting she'd manipulated land documents to gain access to the beach. She had never planned to live here long-term. She just wanted the legacy. The leverage. She never filed it, Jessica said. But she wrote it. Callie nodded slowly. Sometimes people leave truth behind, even when they don't want to. Jessica bit her lip. I'm sorry for what she did. You didn't do it, Callie said, gently. But thank you. This brings closure. They stood in silence as the waves rolled in. In the months that followed, Free Tide Beach became a local legend. Articles were written. A documentary filmmaker asked to do a piece. A city council member even proposed naming the stretch of Shoreline after Callie's father. But Callie declined the formalities. She had a different vision. With donations from the community, she turned the old boathouse behind her home into a community beach library. A tiny, open-air space where people could borrow a book, leave a story, or just sit and listen to the waves. Every week, someone new left a note. Thanks for giving us back the shore. My kids laugh here now. They didn't before. I forgot how to breathe until I came here. On the 1-year anniversary of the meeting that changed everything, Seabreeze Point held a picnic, open to all. No permits, no patrols, just food, music, and laughter. At sunset, a little girl asked Callie, "Are you the lady who saved the beach?" Callie knelt beside her. "No," she said with a soft smile. "The beach was always here. I just reminded everyone it didn't belong to just one person." The girl hugged her and ran off. Callie stood looking at the horizon. The tide was rising, but this time, it wasn't a threat. It was a promise. Because freedom doesn't come from control. It comes from people who care enough to protect what matters, quietly, bravely, together. And that was something no HOA could ever regulate. Life lesson from the HOA beachfront battle. This story reminds us that sometimes the most powerful form of resistance is simply standing your ground, quietly, consistently, and with purpose. Callie Rivera didn't fight for glory or recognition. She fought to protect a legacy, a truth, and a place that mattered, not just to her, but to everyone too afraid to speak up. In a world where power often hides behind policies and titles, this story proves that one voice, backed by courage and community, can unravel years of silent oppression. You don't need to shout to be heard. You just need to stand firm in what's right, whether it's a shoreline, a belief, or your personal boundaries. Never underestimate the impact of defending what belongs to you. Because when you stand up, others will find the strength to do the same. True freedom begins when people remember what truly belongs to them. Love stories like this? Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more epic HOA showdowns, real-life justice, and powerful lessons that hit home. Hit the bell so you never miss another battle for truth and freedom. Because the next story might just be yours.